Let us continue our cycle of lectures on the sufficiently general theory of governance. Let's begin with the questions that were asked on the theme of the previous lecture. First question. You constantly operate with such a concept as conditioned reflexes. Well, first of all, not constantly. I much more often mention unconditioned reflexes, since they are part of our innate informational algorithmic support. Continuation of the question. Do you know about the active theories of the living? Don't you think that the active approach is in better agreement with the life and idea of the kingdom of God on earth, expressed in activity as in a special property of living matter information measure? In our understanding, it would be wrong to oppose the active approach and the reflectory approach, because both take place in life, and you just need to see when there is a manifestation of activity and when there is a manifestation of a reaction to the impact of the environment or reaction to some internal processes in the person himself. One more question. I've been trying to figure out governance on the basis of virtual structures for a long time. More precisely, as it seems to me, I kind of understood. I have an idea of such governance, but I'm not sure that my ideas correctly fit into the lexicon of the internal predictor of the USSR. I created a theme on the forum of the IP of the USSR 1 year ago. I would be glad to hear your comments and answers to my questions from the theme. Well, I couldn't access the site at the suggested address. Another lecture will be devoted to the theme of governance on the basis of virtual structures. So I think that we will get to the bottom of this question. Question. Yesterday, after watching this video of yours, I slightly corrected my images. More precisely, I assumed, if I understood you correctly, I still see contradictions in different versions of the sufficiently general theory of governance and analytical notes, and added a comment on this in the forum. Thanks a lot. Question. Can an artificial intelligence program carry out the process of setting of objectives, the third stage of the entire function of governance? It can, but limitedly. Since the questions of distinction and the provision of distinction from above go directly to the carrier of the intellect, this is a theme and process that go beyond the functionality of artificial intelligences and various kinds of programs. Next question. Can the predictor-corrector scheme of governance be built on some device for which distinction is not accessible? That is, in fact, on a non-living device. For example, a program, or on a living one, but without a cognitive function. For example, a dog. The predictor-corrector scheme can be implemented on the basis of technology, on the basis of those algorithms that are in the concretics of the subject domain in which the automatic system of governance, or the system of apparatus support for human governance, operates, solves the tasks or prognostics at the pace of the conduction of the process of governance. If this can be provided, then the predictor-corrector scheme can be implemented on the basis of program support and on the basis of more complex things, such as artificial intelligence. But anyway, at some stage, there will be a question about the methodology for implementing prognostics about distinction. And these are already questions that go beyond the thematics of artificial intelligence and program support of this or that governance. Question: can a monkey carry out a predictor-corrector scheme of governance theoretically under some special conditions? Well, in general, any intellect, no matter how primitive it may be, but if it is nonetheless full-fledged as an intellect, it can support the predictor-corrector scheme of governance. Continuation of the question. In my opinion, no. With a monkey, maybe. You need to be a deep expert in the field of cognitive processes of the monkey. Then, perhaps, you can find an answer. But knowing the exact answer is not principle for mastering the sufficiently general theory of governance. It is principle to understand. Why? What and how is a necessary condition for the implementation of the scheme. You see, we differ from the animal world, also in that we ourselves determine the areas of the possible and the impossible for us. How accurately we determine this, how much our definitions are supported from above, is another matter. But we determine. In a number of cases, we reject such a definition. Well, for animals, this sphere is simply closed. Therefore, the question of the monkey psyche and monkey activity is, first of all, a question about the spheres of activity. In their spheres of activity, they can act, among other things, according to the predictor-corrector scheme. Continuation of the question. Why did I come to my conclusion? I'm not sure, therefore I ask. The Sufficiently General Theory of Governance of 2004, The Entire Function of Governance, 10th section. The entire function of governance can be carried out only in an intellectual scheme of governance, which implies the creativity of the system of governance in at least the following areas: detecting factors of the environment that cause the need for governance, the formation of vectors of objectives, the formation of new conceptions of governance, perfecting the methodology and skills of prognosis, when solving the task of stability in terms of predictability, in the formulation of the task of governance, and or in the process of governance, according to the predictor-corrector scheme. So I came to the conclusion that the implementation of the predictor-corrector scheme of governance implies the implementation of the entire function. That is, this is equivalent. The entire function can only be implemented on a device with a cognitive function. Well, I will not read further because the main thing has been said. The entire function of governance and the predictor-corrector scheme, they are not equivalent to each other, because the predictor-corrector scheme can be built as part of the entire function of governance. But such questions as detecting a factor of the environment, working out the methodology of prognosis, introducing the methodology of prognosis into the scheme can be excluded from it. So, if these tasks are completed and the predictor-corrector scheme is built, then, accordingly, it will work on the basis of the methodology loaded into it, and is not characterized by the fact that it carries out the entire function of governance. It is characterized by the fact that it solves the task of prognostics of the behavior of the system at the rate of development of the process of governance. Yes, there is a particular case of the predictor-corrector scheme, an intellectual scheme of governance that carries the entire function of governance, or is capable of carrying it in principle, but this is a particular case of the predictor-corrector scheme. Therefore, the identification of the entire function of governance with the predictor-corrector scheme is an inappropriate identification. Besides, last time I said that it is necessary to draw something. So, when we were making the text of the sufficiently general theory of governance, we gave a minimum of drawings that we needed to explain what's being said, and all the rest of the illustrative materials were proposed to be written, drawn, by those who study the sufficiently general theory of governance. There it was about the fact that if we are not ashamed when our left hemisphere cannot cope with the computational tasks to perform tasks in a column, then we should not be ashamed to draw on our own, illustrating the text that we read. Because the sufficiently general theory of governance itself, and the mastering of it, involves not only mastering the terminological apparatus and working out the skill of fluffing words from the texts about the sufficiently general theory of governance without hesitation. The mastering of the sufficiently general theory of governance presupposes, first of all, the working out of a personal culture of senses that allows you to adequately perceive the world, presupposes the construction in your psyche of a model of the world, models of those specific processes that you intend to govern, or, due to various kinds of life circumstances, it so happened that you have entered into these processes and need to be able to govern them according to your own discretion. This requires, first of all, image thinking. Image thinking differs from abstract logical thinking. It differs first of all in that it is concrete. It draws some images, or a plurality of images. These pluralities, and these images as part of the pluralities, they change precisely as a result of the fact that image thinking flows. And abstract logical thinking gives out the results of image thinking to the outside world, to other people, through oral speech and texts. Well, it's not a secret for me that one of the complaints against me is that I speak slowly, and on YouTube it is necessary to increase the speed. Whoever likes what from 1.2 to 2 in order for you to perceive the whole thing calmly. But you see, when I speak, I am in fact laying out for you a certain cartoon that I watch in my inner gaze. When a person speaks faster than he understands, then quite often stupid things are said. I try to avoid this. So now about the drawings. Well, here is the simplest drawing. You should have gotten this picture yourself when it came to what an enclosed system is. Here is an enclosed system in the classics of the theory of governance. This is the combination of the system of governance and the object of governance by the contours of feed-forward and feedback lines. The feedback lines are designated by the letters FBL, and the feed-forward lines are designated by FFL. This is the classics. The definition of the enclosed system in the sufficiently general theory of governance in general does not differ from the definition of an enclosed system in the classics. But feed-forward and feedback lines go not only from the system of governance into the object, but also from the object into the system of governance. Here we also have the environment. Feed-forward lines also go into it. Feedback lines come from it. Well, why is this done? Because usually, after all, In the process of governance, in most cases, information is really given out, not only into the object, but also into the environment. If you are driving, governing a car, then the governing impact in relation to the car is rotation of the steering wheel, and accordingly, the wheels. But normal people indicate a turn by activating the turn signals. As a result of activating the turn signals, nothing happens to the car, but nonetheless, you give out information into the environment that you are going to turn. And this way of governing a car provides greater safety for you and other road users. And accordingly, when you are moving, then you also appreciate the signals that other drivers give, including their turn signals and other lighting equipment in cars. Therefore, the definition of feed-forward and feedback lines as going not only into the object of governance, but also into the environment, and going out into the system of governance from the object of governance and from the environment in the sufficiently general theory of governance is more appropriate than the definition of an enclosed system in the classics. In addition, it is also possible that a second system of governance appears in the environment. So it will be like this. Here we have system 2, and then it turns out that those lines that were feed-forward for system of governance 1 become feedback for system of governance 2. And then the question arises as to whose conception of governance is hierarchically higher, and who governs whom. System of governance 1 governs the object and system of governance number 2 in the environment, or vice versa. System of governance 2 governs the object and system of governance 1. And the only question is, how in the concretics of life circumstances both of these governances are combined? Well, in addition to this, you yourself should have made an analog of that drawing, which is in the sufficiently general theory of governance. It shows the vector of objectives, the vector of current state of the system, and the vector of error of governance. And also, explanations are given on how they are interconnected with each other, and what internal structure each of them has. That's all that concerns the previous lecture. In the previous lecture, I gave a general overview of the sufficiently general theory of governance. And in subsequent lectures, starting with today, we will deal with different fragments of the first lecture, in more detail. Today's lecture is devoted to the entire function of governance. The entire function of governance is an initial, ultimate general concept of the sufficiently general theory of governance. If you understand what the entire function of governance is, there are only 8 points, then, if necessary, from the concept of the entire function of governance, you can expand the entire sufficiently general theory of governance with the needed by you detailedness, and you can build a theory of governance for any specific object or process based on your own governorial needs. The first stage of the entire function of governance is the detection of a factor of the environment that puts pressure on the psyche, which causes the subjective need for governance. Governance according to the entire function starts precisely with this. If you turn to textbooks on management, to many applied theories of governance, then you will find that the question of where the process of governance begins is passed over, left in the defaults, and the factor of the environment that impacts the psyche of the individual and causes the need for governance, this is usually absent. The presentation of processes of governance begins with some other subsequent stages, at best with setting of objectives. And then the questions arise as to how in the process of governance these objectives are realized. Nonetheless, one must still start with the fact that governance begins with the appearance of discomfort in the human psyche. And this discomfort is conditioned by his interaction with the environment. Moreover, you see, since the sufficiently general theory of governance describes particular processes of governance that flow in the stream of the encompassing processes, then the definition of the first stage of the entire function of governance, it contains in fact a lot of defaults, about which you should guess for yourself, although many of these defaults are clarified further in the text of the sufficiently general theory of governance. What are these defaults? Well, first of all, the fact is that the factors of the environment that impact the psyche and cause discomfort, they can be different, and they can reach the psyche in different ways. Well, it really could be a factor of the environment that we perceive with our bodily senses, but there may be factors of the environment that we perceive with biofield senses. And then the only question is, to what extent and how the biofield sense organs of every one of us have channels for conscious perception of what we really perceive through these biofield sense organs. Another question with factors of the environment is connected with the fact that the logic of the sufficiently general theory of governance is not compatible with atheism. Since it includes such a term as the hierarchically highest all-encompassing governance. This is almightiness. Further, the sufficiently general theory of governance is abstractionism. This abstractionism is human abstractionism, however, but not the abstractionism of any other creatures. And if we proceed from human positions, then the human soul is a non-worldly phenomenon. And in relation to the soul, this whole world is an external environment, including our own beloved organism. This is also an external environment in relation to the human soul. And accordingly, the impact of the external environment can flow in some way through the inner world of man, which, in the majority of cases, we do not perceive as the impact of the external environment. So, this is a question about terms. The second question is related to the fact that we came to this world not meaninglessly. There is a destiny as a certain multivariate program of life given to every soul from above. And this program of life, by virtue of its multivariativeness, includes a certain variant minimum that man must realize in the course of his life, and a certain variant maximum that exceeds the variant minimum and can be either an alternative to it, or the variant minimum can be part of the variant maximum. But if we come to the world not meaninglessly, then our destiny is a part of the algorithmics in governance according to the predictor corrector scheme carried out from above. And accordingly, factors of the environment, in our usual understanding of this term, may not exist. But internal motives stemming from almightiness can be in the human psyche, and they can act in accordance with these motives, organizing some processes that will be wanted by life in the future, sometimes in the distant future, in the predictor corrector scheme of governance, carried out by the hierarchically highest, all-encompassing governance. Therefore, the question about the factor of the environment that causes the need for governance, or the question simply about the factor that causes the need for governance, is indeed a very important moment in the implementation of the entire function of governance. And the answer to it should be given in every concrete case when you intend to undertake these or those actions. Further, the question of illusions and reality is connected with this. Well, you can govern only processes that objectively exist in reality. If you have an illusion that the process exists, that there is this factor that impacts and causes the need for governance, then your disappointment in the future will be quite real. Well, if in terms of an anecdote, if you don't see a sucker in the scheme, then the sucker is you. Suckerness is always connected with the emergence of certain illusions. Illusions inspired in your psyche from the outside, or illusions that you created for yourself, based on some mistakes in your personal culture of perception of the world, the culture of meaningful comprehension of the world, NRAVIOUSNESS and ethics, which push you not to those objectives and tasks that really should be solved. This is what concerns the first stage of the entire function of governance, detecting the factor of the environment. What further? Further, you have to understand. And to understand, this means that with the image that you perceived, formed, you must correlate certain lexical forms so that you can talk about it with other people, so that you can teach them something, give them some new knowledge, and, conversely, can perceive some knowledge from other people through lexical channels of information exchange between all of us. This is the formation of a skill, a stereotype of recognizing the factor of the environment for the future, and the spread of this skill in the culture of society. In essence, this is a question about characteristic features that this factor possesses. Why is it so important? Because if you use an incomplete set of features, then you will identify with this factor some subpluralities of the actions of this factor. This will generate certain errors in your activities. if, along with this factor, there are some other factors that are described by a wider set of features, and you will mistakenly identify them with your factor, then there will also be troubles. Therefore, the question of the set of features that characterize the factors you are dealing with is a really very important question, which is also related to how all this is built. The vector of objectives of governance, the vector of current state, the vector of error of governance. Because if some feature drops out of these sets, then you either cannot carry out the process of governance, or you carry out some other process of governance, which may become unstable if any characteristic feature from the full list exerts its impact on the flow of the process. The third stage of the entire function of governance is the setting of objectives in relation to the factor that was detected in the first stage. Setting of objectives can be different. The simplest reaction is to get away from the impact of this factor. Yes, such a reaction is possible, but the consequences of such a reaction can be unpleasant in the long term. Because if you detected some possibility of trouble at the first stage, and at the third stage decided that this did not concern you, then, in life situations, there may arise a situation in which the possibility begins to be realized, and it will concern you so much that you will know all about it. Therefore, the questions of setting of objectives must be resolved in relation to the particular processes of governance that you aspire to govern, or that are de facto under your governance. The questions of setting of objectives must be resolved on the basis of how these objectives are related to other, hierarchically higher, encompassing in relation to your process of governance, processes. Because if you are trying to ignore the encompassing processes in questions of setting of objectives, then Elvira Nabulina can make a document, as a result of which your business plan will collapse. If your objective is to not miss the Titanic, which is preparing to leave for her maiden voyage, then you will be in trouble when the Titanic hits the iceberg. Well, the Titanic, this is the past. But, nonetheless, the Titanic is a metaphor which allows one to explain a lot in life. Therefore, setting of objectives in relation to the detected factor is also a very important stage. Setting of objectives, which is an alternative to avoiding a problem, always presupposes a reaction to the problem, either prevention of the problem, if you enter into governance towards a particular process in the stream of the encompassing process flowing in the predictor-corrector scheme, or a reaction to an already urgent problem, or overcoming the consequences of a catastrophic resolution of this problem, which could also be your omission in the process of governance. But it could be the omission of other people, sometimes in the very distant past. Because if we talk about what we are now experiencing in Russia, then We are experiencing the consequences of the fact that in the era before the baptism of Rus, someone in Rus did not react properly to the information about the beginning of the biblical project of buying up the world based on a monopoly on usury. Therefore, the questions of setting of objectives are really very important. And they are important precisely in the fact that such circumstances can manifest themselves, which are characterized by the aphorism of Kozma Prutkov. From small causes, there are big consequences. Setting of objectives usually does not take place out of thin air. Usually, when you start to engage in setting of objectives, then you already have a certain vector of objectives, and accordingly, the question arises. The question of how your setting of objectives, in relation to this detected factor of the environment, will interact with the vector of objectives that you already support. Well, here too, the variants are different. Either you successfully integrate a new objective into the vector of objectives, in accordance with which you already live and act, or a situation may arise that the new objectives will be incompatible with the vector of objectives in which you live. And, accordingly, if it is not compatible, this will put you before the question of how to abandon either the new objective or those objectives that you supported up until the time of determining the task of this new objective. Therefore, questions of setting of objectives are also very important questions. Setting of objectives poses the question of how to achieve objectives. The question of how to achieve objectives is precisely the question that generates the sufficiently general theory of governance. You see, if we want something and we can directly impact it, then there is no need to talk about the theory of governance. But in most cases, what we want is not achievable right away, instantly, or very quickly. And it may not be realizable by directly impacting the object of our wants and desires, purpose, aspiration. And in order to realize our chosen objective, our chosen vector of objectives, we may need to impact something else, which we can directly impact, or we need to create in order to impact it. And the direct impact on this something will entail such changes in life that will lead to the achievement of our chosen objectives. Therefore, the question of setting of objectives leads to the question of building a conception for achieving objectives. The conception for achieving objectives, in the vast majority of cases, is a very complex theme. Building the conception for achieving objectives requires a personal cognitive creative culture. Because if this cognitive creative culture is not present, or it is not adequate, then the objectives for you may be desirable, understandable, but you can never foresee the process as a result of which these objectives will be achieved. Well, and accordingly, In this case, you may find yourself in the situation described by the fable, The Fox and the Grapes. Yes, the objectives are good, everything is fine, but there will be an excuse. Sour. But who is sour? The grapes or you? You are not ripe to form a conception of governance. And if you are not ripe, then in some cases it is not only a problem for you, but also for those around you. Because if there is no one to form a conception of governance, then the task of governance will not be set and will not be solved. Look around. Basically, public politicians talk about what objectives should be set. But they rarely talk about how these objectives are achieved. Why? This is precisely why. Personal cognitive creative culture does not enable them to form a conception for achieving objectives. If there is no conception for achieving objectives, then, of course, you can steer silently by intuition. But in order to steer by intuition, you must have an even higher cognitive creative culture and a personal culture of psychic as a whole activity. Because to carry out social governance at the same level as termites do, well, that's when a group of termites is simply divided by a glass wall, and they begin to build a termite mound. Then, if upon completion of the process you remove the glass wall, then the entrances and the exits of the right and left halves will coincide and will be at the right place. A coordination of activities in human society, the activities of many different people located in different places, and sometimes acting outside of mutual communication with each other. Well, given the level of development of the culture that exists, it is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, impossible. And in order to organize collective activity, it is precisely the conception of governance that is required, with which different people could get acquainted and could find, every one of them, his own place, his own endeavor, and engage in his endeavor in such a way that his endeavor supplements the endeavors of other people in some common processes. Moreover, this formation of the conception of governance concerns all problems without exception. Problems of various scales, from the problems of eliminating the global biospheric social ecological crisis to the problems of stable operation of an enterprise in the market for a long time, allowing its employees to live and happily solve all the problems of ensuring the life of their families. Everything rests on the conception of governance, its adequacy to the circumstances of implementation, its adequacy to the encompassing processes, and the prospects for their development. If you form a certain conception for achieving a particular vector of objectives, then you must carefully put it into the conception of flow and self-governance, or of governance towards the encompassing processes. If you cannot do this, then expect troubles in the process of governance, from a lower quality of governance to a total collapse of the process of governance that you started. But if the conception of governance is formed, in the majority of cases, the conception of governance cannot be implemented alone. Accordingly, the fifth stage of the entire function of governance is the implementation of the conception of governance into life, the organization of new or reorganization of existing structures of governance carrying the corresponding objective functions of governance. Well, in the aspect of social governance, the implementation of the conception of governance into life is its propaganda, providing the people around with the knowledge necessary for its realization. In the sphere of technology, the implementation of the conception of governance into life is the construction of objects of the technosphere that will solve certain tasks in an automatic mode, or in the mode of governing people in the functioning of these technical objects. Again, in the aspect of social governance, if it is a collective activity that is governed in a structural way, then the governance towards all social processes in a structural way is always a combination of four factors. First, dividing an integral project into fragments, each of which is more or less organizationally technologically independent from other fragments. Second, this is the distribution of solely personal responsibility for each of the fragments. Third, empowering everyone to whom you have assigned solely personal responsibility, which allows to realize this responsibility. Fourth, the distribution between responsible people of resources which are necessary so that each of them can realize their powers and properly carry out a fragment of this project. Accordingly, the one who distributes the solely personal responsibility, powers, resources, has the solely personal responsibility for governing the project as a whole. Why is responsibility always solely personal? Because if the responsibility is not solely personal, then, under the so-called collective leadership, there will always be some problem for which no one will be responsible. And if the project is critical in relation to this seemingly minor problem, then wait, it will come. A situation will surely arise when this minor problem remains unaccounted for and unresolved, and it will bring down the whole project. If the responsibility is solely personal, then the one who carries this solely personal responsibility, according to his SOVEST and honor, will always find ways to collect all the necessary information in order to bring the fragments of the entrusted to him project, or the project as a whole, to an acceptable result. He himself will provide the search for the necessary information, and the likelihood that something will remain out of his attention, from that in relation to which the project is critical, is significantly lower than if there is no solely personal responsibility, but only collective irresponsibility. This is what is spoken about in the Russian proverb, 7 nannies have a child without an eye. And the Turkish proverb, 2 captains will sink the ship. What further? Further is the 6th stage, monitoring. Monitoring is not a Russian word, but a Russian word is наблюдение, watching the activities of structures in the process of governance. Well, what to say here? Monitoring presupposes a meaningful relation towards what is happening. If the process flows in full accordance with how it was conceived, you can, in fact, do nothing and not interfere with it. If the process deviates from what was conceived, then you must understand why it deviates. Due to errors in the conception of governance, due to errors in the construction of structures, that is, distribution of solely personal responsibility and everything connected with it, or it's a natural impact of the environment in which the process of governance is carried out. And those structures that exist, they may well cope with this impact of the environment, in some way changing the flow of the governed process. Well, last time I talked about how governance is possible, not only on the basis of a structural method of governance. Governance is possible both on the basis of a structureless method of governance and on the basis of governance on virtual structures. In fact, both of these methods of governance also imply the implementation of the general conception of governance into life. Well, in contrast to the structural method of governance, the implementation of the conception in a structureless method of governance and in governance on the basis of virtual structures, it has its own specifics. In the first case, in structureless governance, information simply spreads in a supersystem, as in an environment. Those who are ready to perceive this information will perceive this information when faced with certain circumstances. They themselves will generate the necessary structures, or take the necessary actions that will ensure the implementation of the conception of governance. With governance on the basis of virtual structures, well, in fact, the same thing. But first, you create a structure that penetrates the supersystem, and it further spreads information, or directly governs in accordance with the conception. Next is the 7th stage. Perfection of the current conception in the case of necessity. At the basis of the construction of the conception of governance lies the solution of the task of stability in terms of predictability of the object of governance, the process that you take under your governance in terms of predictability of behavior. The task of stability in terms of predictability of behavior must be solved with a certain accuracy. If you do not solve it on the basis of receiving a direct prophecy from the Almighty, then your prognosis will contain some error. This is inevitable. The error may not be critical in relation to the implementation of the process of governance, but the error may also be critical. And if the error is critical, then, in this case, you should revise your prognosis. In accordance with the revision of the prognosis, there may arise the necessity to correct the conception. Correction of the conception, in turn, may entail the need to rebuild structures, rebuild the character of the organization of structureless governance, and governance on the basis of virtual structures, if you are engaged in these matters. The main thing is that the initial prognosis does not require a radical breakdown of the previous conception and its replacement with a new, more adequate one. But even if this happens, it is better to correct the conception, replace it with a new one, before the governance according to the old conception leads to a catastrophe. Therefore, the perfection of the current conception, in the case of necessity, is necessary. It requires the construction of the first conception, a certain state of the worldview, a certain personal culture of senses, a world understanding, a culture of psychic and intellectual activity. You see, governance is an objective process, but governance is always subjectively conditioned. Therefore, there is a certain correspondence between the governor and the process. There is a book written by Edward Bernard Tyler, a 19th century English ethnographer. He writes there about the Algonquin Indian tribe. They had such a tradition that at the age of about 14, the boys went into solitude, fasted, and the one who accompanied them wrote down their dreams. The task of this procedure was to identify those whose dreams came true, because the processes of governance are organized in such a way that the lower the probability of self-realization of any objective, the higher the professionalism, the ability of the governor to achieve these objectives. Therefore, the objectives unachievable for some governors are easily and simply achievable for other governors. Well, this is most clearly seen in medicine. There are virtuoso doctors who treat everything that their other colleagues refuse. But there are doctors about whom they say, God forbid. It's better not to fall into their hands, because the statistics of erroneousness, diagnostics, the statistics of the erroneousness of the application of medical methods are such that it is better not to have anything to do with them. Well, then comes the 8th stage. The 8th stage involves the achievement of objectives. This is the correct result of governance, which was correctly constructed and correctly implemented. What is behind it? If the objectives are one time, then this is the freeing of resources that were used in the process of governance. If the objectives are still relevant, then the structures that have arisen should be functionally operable in the future. Well, here is an example of this. The armed forces of states as a potential to ensure readiness for defense. Fire services are constantly ready to put out a fire if it breaks out. Well, if the objectives of governance were not achieved, then we return to the first point. We have to rethink, from the beginning, the entire function of governance that we have tried to implement. But this is possible, provided that the failure to achieve the objectives was not accompanied by a catastrophe, after which we look at this world from another world. If, nevertheless, a catastrophe arose by our fault, by the fault of other people, then the question arises of overcoming the catastrophe. This is crisis governance. Well, again, it should proceed according to the entire function of governance. Detecting a factor, in this case a description of the catastrophe, detecting possibilities for overcoming the catastrophe, forming a conception of the catastrophe, and forming a conception for overcoming the catastrophe. Further, everything is according to the entire function. So this is the entire function of governance. From it you can expand any theory of governance, any sufficiently general theory of governance in particular, any applied narrowly specialized theory of governance that allows you to solve particular tasks and organize collective activities. Universal literacy in the aspect of understanding what the entire function of governance is and how it is implemented in life. These are the necessary foundations for narrow professionals of different spheres to find a common language and participate in collective projects, mutually helping each other without generating at the same time unpredictable, negative consequences of their activities. Well, that's it for today. If you have any questions, then text them. We'll see, we will answer either during the next lectures or during another explanation on questions and answers. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye. All the best.